Today we will explain the book, Why Buddhism is True. I will explain the essence. The significance of Buddhism is to liberate us from the perspective of natural selection and to observe, experience the world from a higher level. Before we dive in, please click on the subscribe button to stay updated. This book was published in August 2017, written by science author and evolutionary psychology scholar Robert Wright. When you hear the title Why Buddhism is True, you might be surprised that an American wants to write about Buddhism. In fact, Buddhism is very popular in the United States, and many people practice it. At this point, you likely have many questions. Is Buddhism authentic? Is Buddhism superstition? Is this book intended to promote religion? Of course not. We are discussing Buddhism, not Buddhist religion. I believe that the advantage of Buddhism is that it allows for speculation. It never obfuscates and always explains its principles in clear and straightforward language. Wright's book tries to explain some Buddhist concepts and views using modern scientific knowledge. The book includes much modern scientific evidence to show that Buddha's related teachings back then were correct. These concepts and views exclude supernatural phenomena. There are no 6 realms of rebirth, no karmic retribution, and certainly no supernatural powers. We essentially consider Buddha a wise philosopher. The best thing about this book is that it is relatively simple and straightforward, without any ambiguity, speaking in the modern language. This way you can analyze and argue it like any philosophy and use modern scientific knowledge to verify it. Alright, let's proceed by explaining 3 common Buddhist concepts to understand the basic ideas and logic of this book. In the first part, we'll discuss the foundational Buddhist concept of suffering, or where our troubles come from. In the second part, we'll examine what meditation really is. In the third part, we'll explain the meaning behind the oft-heard phrase, form is emptiness. Part 1. Let's start with the first part. Where does suffering come from? We all know that suffering is a significant concept in Buddhism. Back then, Siddhartha Gautama decided to start practicing after seeing the 4 kinds of suffering: birth, aging, sickness, and death. But what does suffering mean? Does it imply that the world deliberately makes us suffer? Or is it that suffering is tied to one's cultivation, and enlightened individuals don't feel suffering? For instance, some say that suffering is due to attachment. If you're not so attached, you won't suffer as much. In this book, Wright believes that suffering is dissatisfaction, which also has a basis in Buddhism. Some researchers believe that the early Buddhist texts define suffering more accurately as dissatisfaction. Wright offers an evolutionary psychology explanation for this in the book. From the perspective of biological evolution, humans are alive to spread their genes. To spread genes, we need to do various things like eat, have children, compete, gain prestige, etc. But humans are thinking beings, so some may prefer to enjoy the scenery of nature and live peacefully without caring much about spreading their genes. What does natural selection do to make us willing to do these things? Wright says that natural selection has made 3 psychological settings for us. When doing those things, you get pleasure. Eating and falling in love can be delightful. Pleasure is short-lived, it doesn't last long. If we could experience lasting joy from doing something once, we'd have no motivation to do it again. So natural selection wants you to repeat those activities. The brain should focus on the first point and ignore the second. If the brain clearly realized that pleasure is short-lived, it might give up pursuing pleasure and start questioning life. In other words, natural selection doesn't care whether we're happy. It merely uses happiness as bait to achieve its goal of gene propagation. From the perspective of gene propagation, this is a good thing, but for individuals, this is very sad. A person's life is always in pursuit, and the joy we get is always fleeting. Scientific experiments have proven this mechanism. In one experiment with monkeys, the researchers hung a light in a cage that, when lit, would provide the monkeys with some drops of fruit juice, which the monkeys liked. Scientists closely observed the monkeys' dopamine secretion in their brains. The secretion of dopamine indicates that the brain is experiencing pleasure. Initially, the monkeys' brains secreted much dopamine after the fruit juice entered their mouths. This clearly showed that the juice made the monkeys happy. But after repeating the experiment several times, the monkeys understood the pattern that juice would follow the light. The scientists then discovered that in the instant after the light came on and before the juice was given, the monkeys' brains had already started secreting much dopamine. The anticipation of the juice already made the monkeys happy. Later on, the light caused the monkeys to secrete more and more dopamine, while the juice led to less and less dopamine secretion. It seemed like the monkeys' happiness was entirely in the anticipation of the juice, and they weren't as happy when actually drinking it. Aren't humans the same way? Before doing something, we think it'll bring us great joy, but we feel empty after doing it. This is suffering. You'll never really be satisfied. What we call happiness is just an illusion. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, human emotions are natural selections code in our minds, allowing us to make a good or bad judgment about the environment. If an action helps spread genes, you feel happy and will do it again. If an action hinders gene spreading, you'll feel pain and avoid it next time. But these codes can be faulty. The first mistake occurs when the environment changes, but the code doesn't. For example, we tend to crave sweet and high-fat foods. This emotion was beneficial in the past when food was scarce, allowing us to ingest more nutrients. But in today's society where food is abundant, consuming too much of these foods only harms the body. So Wright says our feelings for high sugar and high-fat foods can be considered false feelings. The second mistake is a false positive. For example, a primitive man walking in the wild hears a sound in the bushes. What should he do? The sound is 99% likely caused by the wind, but there's also a 1% chance that a tiger is in the bushes. Would the primitive man ignore the small probability and keep walking forward? Of course not. The correct response is to run away regardless of what it is. This fear of the rustling wind was very effective in primitive society, but today it causes various anxieties. For example, in primitive society, everyone knew each other, so making a good impression was very important, and it was painful to be looked down on. Today, we mostly deal with strangers who don't really care about us, but we still focus on how others see us. As you can see, we have many illusions in our emotions. We think we'll be happy, but happiness is fleeting. We feel strongly about sugar, but too much is harmful. We worry constantly about this and that, but it's usually unfounded. So Buddha said that life is full of suffering and that troubles are illusions. Evolution has coded us to have short-lived pleasure, so we'll never be satisfied, which is life's suffering. Evolution has also coded us to have emotions that don't reflect reality, so our troubles may be empty. This is Wright's explanation of suffering and troubles from an evolutionary psychology perspective, which is the first part of our content. Since troubles and suffering are illusions given to us by natural selection, how should we respond or get rid of them? Meditation may be a good method, but what is meditation? This is the subject of our second part. Part 2. Of course, the meditation we're going to discuss can't cover all meditation concepts. Meditation can be divided into 3 main schools. One is Zen, which involves pondering koans and sometimes making sharp statements to achieve sudden enlightenment, making it more suitable for poets. Another is Tibetan Buddhism, which primarily uses visual imagery, making it more suitable for artists. The type that Wright practices is Vipassana, which aims at mindfulness and is more suitable for psychologists. Vipassana requires you to be your own observer, perceiving your emotions as if a psychologist were analyzing you. However, Vipassana meditation is not just for resting or nurturing one's mind. Its goal is to gain insight and true personal freedom. The form of meditation is very simple. If you seek a sense of ceremony, you can find a quiet place and sit on a mat. There seem to be no strict requirements on the posture. Just don't fall asleep. The first step is to sit down. The second step is to focus on your breathing, think of nothing else, and concentrate solely on breathing. This is not simple at all. When a person does nothing, the brain normally wanders randomly with various thoughts and emotions constantly arising, and we daydream. We often enjoy this state and sometimes even gain creative insights. However, meditation requires you to keep your mind from wandering and focus on breathing. The longer you can maintain this focus, the better your skill. If you practice focusing well, you won't be troubled by emotions and thoughts or controlled by the brain's modules, and you'll gain freedom. Focusing on breathing isn't the goal. The goal is to practice gaining control over your brain. If you can focus for a long time, you'll enter a very calm state. Wright once reached this state, and he said that after a long period of concentration, he experienced a deep calm and great joy. Once you reach the level of long-term concentration, you then have two schools of thought to choose from. Buddhism has a saying called the Eightfold Path, which we can roughly understand as the 8 ways of cultivation. The 7th is right mindfulness, and the 8th is right concentration. If you choose to remain focused on breathing, you practice right concentration, which is the method of Theravada Buddhism. In Vipassana, achieving right concentration through focusing on breathing is just basic skill. Right concentration leads to right mindfulness, which requires you to apply your focusing skills to anything in life at any time. You can focus on admiring a flower or on the taste of food while eating. You can focus on anything. However, pure focus isn't the goal. The real goal is to gain insight from it. You may ask if this is just concentration. It's different. I can concentrate on reading a book, but my thoughts follow the authors, and I constantly associate the book with external content. This kind of concentration is easy. But the concentration in meditation can be called attention retention, which means focusing on one thing and eliminating any extraneous thoughts. Meditation practice can be divided into at least 2 levels. The first is to separate self from strong emotions, so you're not troubled by them. Once you reach this level, you'll immediately experience the benefits of meditation. For example, with a toothache, ordinary people may complain and resist the pain. The more they resent it, the more pain they feel, and their entire mind is taken over by the pain. In meditation, you first acknowledge the pain and then ignore it, maintaining a distance from it. The pain still exists, but you aren't controlled by this feeling. If you can practice to this level, you'll never be emotional again, and will always be able to adjust your mood. A higher level is to separate yourself from all thoughts and truly focus on breathing without thinking of anything else. In fact, in most cases, it's the little thoughts that disturb our concentration. For example, what will I do at work tomorrow? I look forward to meeting a woman I like. I recall an impressive moment on the court yesterday. Wright says these thoughts have some commonalities. They either review the past or contemplate the future, and aren't about the present. These thoughts often involve you. When meditating, you're unlikely to automatically think of astrophysics. Thoughts also often involve another person. Humans are social animals and always think about people. Finally, these thoughts are almost always provided by a specific module in the brain, which are all products of evolution. You can understand it this way: thoughts are produced by modules, which attract your attention with a certain emotion and try to hijack your brain. How do you separate yourself from your thoughts? The method is still to acknowledge the thought when it arises, then keep a distance from it, not think about it, and focus on your breathing. It's like standing in a train station with thoughts as trains that come and go, but you never board them. In other words, whether it's strong emotions or ordinary thoughts, the method isn't to suppress or destroy them but to acknowledge and allow their presence without being affected by them. Reaching the first level lets you choose your emotions freely. Reaching the second lets you choose your thoughts freely, undisturbed and uncontrolled. This ability is remarkable. In Buddhist terms, you'll gradually break free from suffering. But this skill is tough to practice. It isn't something you can do by pushing hard in one direction. It is filled with contradictions. The first contradiction is inaction and success. In meditation, the harder you try to concentrate, the harder it is to focus. but you'll achieve success if you don't deliberately pursue it. The second contradiction is that those who most need meditation training are the hardest to get into a meditative state. The third contradiction is that the more you reject a thought or emotion and fight against it, the more you're controlled by it. The fourth contradiction is that the more you understand that people can't control their emotions, emotions control people, the more you can avoid being controlled by emotions. In other words, if you initially think you can control yourself, you can't. If you realize you can't control yourself, you've taken the first step in controlling yourself. These contradictions make meditation training very challenging. If you don't believe it, try it. Alright, in the first part we talked about suffering and troubles. In the second part we discussed meditation. Both parts are actually related to a Buddhist concept, emptiness. Troubles are empty and emotions are empty. Also for us, another concept related to emptiness is the familiar phrase form is emptiness. What do these words mean? This is the content of our third part. Part 3. For form is emptiness, the book explains that realizing the world is empty is beneficial because you can recognize many things in this world are illusory, and you can indeed withdraw from them. Let's explain this further. Once Wright was attending a meditation class. Outside the classroom, workers were using an electric saw to cut wood, filling the room with the noise of the saw. The electric saw's noise was hard to bear, but Wright used his meditation skills and first acknowledged his feeling of disliking the saw noise, then examined that feeling. The saw noise still existed, but it seemed to lack any negative emotions. Eventually, Wright even found the saw noise pleasant, detecting a musical tone in it. This experience was Wright's first encounter with form is emptiness. Wright said the saw noise is just an objective presence. We dislike it because it brings fearful associations. When you think of an electric saw, you think of how it can cut wood and people, representing a destructive force. These fearful associations are the essence people attribute to the saw noise. Form is the essence you associate with the saw noise, which you might call the saw form. You only face a sound, not a menacing saw that wants to hurt you. The saw noise exists, the saw form is empty. Some people think empty means nothingness, that nothing in the world exists, but Wright says most Buddhist scholars believe emptiness doesn't mean the world's things are empty, but that the essence we attribute to things is empty. This understanding has the support of psychology. Psychologist Paul Bloom believes a characteristic of humans is that they emphasize the essence of things. For example, a tape measure bought from a store might cost a few dollars, but if it was used by President Kennedy, it could fetch $40,000 or $50,000 at auction. Wedding rings are just rings, but if a ring has been on your finger for 30 or 40 years, it has great meaning to you. So the history of an object gives it significance. Psychologist Robert Wright further believes that we automatically attribute meaning to everything we see. For instance, the letter Q. If you think of QQ, you may feel friendly. If you think of Q, you may have other emotions. In short, you have feelings about everything. According to Wright, natural selection wants us to quickly make good or bad judgments about our surroundings to benefit survival. If you don't mind the sound of a saw, you're not good at avoiding danger. The feelings that things evoke in us are the essence we attribute to them, the form. By this logic, if you think of form as our essence judgments of things, modern psychology has discovered some properties of form through experiments. Form, or essence, is generated automatically. When we see an object, we automatically describe it like tall or short. Essence is influenced by stories. Why is Da Vinci's Mona Lisa a famous painting? Because it has a story. Essence is subjective, as in 1,000 readers have 1,000 Hamlets. So we look at the world through colored lenses, always attributing essence to the things around us. The world we see is a world full of form. This is the book's explanation of form. Wright told a story about weeds which I can relate to. When we first bought our house, the lawn looked great. Later, because we didn't maintain it well, some weeds like dandelions started growing on the lawn. Sometimes I found them annoying and would pull them out. When my parents visited us in the US and saw me pulling weeds, they asked why I was pulling out the dandelions. They said the dandelions have little yellow flowers, which decorate the lawn nicely. My parents appreciated nature and thought dandelions looked good. I, on the other hand, wanted to maintain the lawn and saw the dandelions as a nuisance. So, should dandelions be allowed to grow there? You see, the essence we attribute to the world is subjective and full of contradictions, and form affects our perception of reality. So what would the world look like without colored lenses? Wright says it may be a formless world, which will make you feel the world is empty. Wright's cultivation hasn't reached a high level, but he interviewed some experts. One practitioner said that as meditation practice deepens, you will genuinely experience emptiness, and your form perception of the world will decrease. Of course, you'll still see all these things. Chair will still be a chair, but its presence in your mind won't be as strong. Wright shared his explanation of formless with the practitioner. The practitioner said his own practice was more like he first felt that all things were empty, then became indifferent to them. But Wright said the opposite. That feeling first reduced led to feeling that all things are empty. This cause and effect relationship may be opposite, but in general, understanding formlessness is understanding emptiness. This practitioner also mentioned two distinct experiences. When you realize emptiness and formlessness, you will see things more realistically than before. People's preconceived notions about these things aren't real. This is form is emptiness. Some people often ask whether Buddhism would make people lose the joys of life or find everything dull. But Buddhism is about greater freedom, allowing you to freely choose what you want to experience. Eliminating subjective interference will enable you to gain a richer experience. It's said that this will bring greater joy and happiness. Alright, I've explained the basic logic of why Buddhism is true. Let's summarize. From the perspective of evolutionary psychology, natural selection has programmed our minds to view everything with emotional color, generating various emotions. If something appears beneficial for gene propagation, we consider it good, which is greed. Conversely, if it seems bad, it's aversion. You can think of Buddhism as a way to transcend natural selection. Why transcend natural selection? Because the settings of natural selection are inherently irrational. Wright says the basic assumption that natural selection gives everyone is that you're special and more important than others. We always judge good and bad from a self-centered perspective. But this basic assumption can't be correct because there are so many living beings in the world, and not every organism is more important than another, nor is every person special. A piece of rotting meat from a human perspective is full of bacteria and harmful to health, so it seems like a bad thing. But from the bacteria's perspective, rotting meat is their breeding ground. This is form is emptiness. When you understand this, the meat is just meat. No good or bad. This is why we said at the beginning that the significance of Buddhism is to liberate us from the limited perspective of natural selection and observe and experience the world from a higher level. 2,600 years ago, Buddha sensed the limitations of natural selection on human thought. Without any modern scientific tools, he identified the problem, found a solution, and developed a Buddhist system that unites knowledge and action. Buddha went so far that later generations found him difficult to understand. 2,600 years later, modern science allows us to rediscover the same problems, enabling us to learn from Buddha's methods and verify his ideas. That's the essence of this book. You can click the description below the video to find the link to the book. Welcome to read it. You can also share this book with your friends. If you like the content of Daily Book Dive, click the subscribe button to stay updated. Your encouragement helps us continue bringing book essence to our community. Congratulations, you've finished another book.